That ain't tack tape. I don't care what your eyes are trying to tell you to make this easier. That ain't tack tape. Because tack tape don't blink. I counted 5. 5. I know I counted 5. Slow and careful. Right there in my beam. And there's a 6th one now. Low in the laurel. Pressed into bark that I never touched. And it just blinked at me. Both of them blinked together. Soft. Like a eye closing and opening in a dream you can't wake from. And now they're moving. Sliding down that trunk, easy as water finding the low ground. And I gotta stop talking long enough to watch where it goes. Because if I look away from it, I got a feeling I won't find it again. Just give me one more second. Well now, come on in out of that draft and pull that blanket up over your knees. Because if you're hearing my voice in the dark tonight, you're already about halfway to where I need you to be. My name's Silas Vance. Folks up and down this ridge have called me Abe since before I could shave. On account of my granddaddy carried that same Abraham, and I answered to it long before I ever answered to my own Christian name. I've lived on this mountain the better part of 70 years. First down in my daddy's cabin along the hollow bottom, then up here closer to the trail, once my knees quit forgiving me for the climb both ways. I've slept under more open sky and rotted shelter roofing than most men sleep under a proper ceiling. And in all them years, there's only a handful of nights that still sit cold in my chest when I lay my own head down. This is one of 'em, and I'm going to tell it slow, the way it happened, because slow is the only way this mountain ever tells anybody anything. Now, some of you're new to sitting with me of an evening, so let me set the porch light on who I am before we go any further into the dark. I was raised on stories same as this one, told to me by men who smelled of wood smoke and chew and never once raised their voice above what the fire needed. My daddy walked this ridge as a boy the way I did, and his daddy before him. And somewhere along that long line of Vance men, somebody decided it fell to us to keep count of what happens up here and pass it on proper, so it don't get lost the way so much else gets lost on a mountain like this. I've guided lost thru-hikers down off this very ridge in weather that would have buried a lesser man's good sense, and sat with search parties in the cold hours before dawn, holding a thermos and not much hope. And I've learned in all that time that the stories folks call folklore up here ain't folklore at all. They're just reports. Slow reports told by slow men about a mountain that don't hurry for nobody. And don't forget nothing either. It was late October, the kind of late where the leaves have already give up their color and gone the brown of old paper. And the cold comes down off the ridge, not like weather, but like something that's been waiting all year for its turn. A solo hiker, I won't trouble you with which direction he was walking, because direction don't matter much to what's coming, had made his camp at a three-sided shelter tucked back off the trail. One of them old lean-tos built of hand-hewed logs gone silver with age, open on the fourth wall to whatever the night decided to bring. And what it brought that night, before the boy even got his pack off his shoulders, was fog. Now, I don't mean the thin kind that burns off with the first bit of sun. I mean what we call up here the granddaddy fog. Fog that don't roll in so much as it simply arrives, like it had been sitting there the whole time, patient, and only now decided to let itself be seen. It's thick as milk poured slow into water, and it swallows sound the same way it swallows light, so that a man standing 20 feet off can call your name, and it'll reach you soft and flat, like it come from 20 miles instead. Old-timers will tell you the granddaddy fog only shows up thick as that on nights when the mountains got something it means to do. I didn't used to put much stock in that particular piece of superstition. I do now. That fog don't just take your sight, neither. It takes your sense of size. A tree 10 feet off can look like it's leaning right over your shoulder, and the sound from a boulder 40 yards off can land against your ear, soft and close as a whisper, meant only for you. It's a lonesome dark, the granddaddy fog. Not empty lonesome. The mountain's never truly empty, but lonesome the way a room feels once you notice you can't see the walls no more. The hiker had made good time that day, but he'd let his water run down low. Foolish enough thing to do this far into a cold season, when a body don't feel the thirst the way he does in July. And by the time he got his tarp strung and his bag laid out, his last bottle was near empty, and the map showed a spring branch a short piece off the trail, down through a stand of laurel thicket, so dense and dark it looked, in his headlamp beam, less like brush and more like a wall somebody'd grown on purpose to keep folks from wandering where they didn't belong. Now here's where I want you to lean in close, because this next part is the part that matters, the part that always matters in these stories, which is the small, sensible mistake that don't feel like a mistake at all when you're making it. He knew that thicket, once the fog thickened up proper, was gonna eat his light and his sense of direction both. So he did what any careful hiker's been taught to do. He dug down in his pack and come up with a little tin of retroreflective silver thumbtacks, the kind meant for hanging notices on a corkboard. cheap and bright, but coated in that same sheetin' they put on road signs, so that a headlamp catches 'em and throws the light clean back at you, like a little star nailed into the bark. One by one, going down toward the water, he pressed 5 of 'em into 5 trees, spaced out along the game path he was following, so that coming back in the dark and the fog, all he'd have to do is count his silver dots and know he was walking true. It's a fine practice. I've taught it to greener hikers myself more than once, back when I still guided folks through these hollows. There's nothing wrong with the thumbtacks. There's nothing wrong even with trusting 'em. A little silver point of borrowed light pressed into bark at eye level has walked plenty of frightened souls home safe over the years, mine included, back when I was young enough to still get myself turned around down in them bottoms. But a marker's only ever as honest as the hand that counts it. And out here, in that particular hollow, on that particular night, with the granddaddy fog pressing in the way it was, the counting hand belonged to a tired young man who'd walked near 20 miles since sunup, and just wanted, more than anything else in the world right then, to lay his body down. The trouble was in what he did with that trust on the way back. He filled his bottles at the spring, water so cold it ached his teeth just from the smell of it. And he started back up through the laurel, with the granddaddy fog pressed in thick all around him now. Thick enough that his headlamp beam didn't so much light the path as carve out one small tunnel of white in a world gone otherwise the color of a blind eye. And in that tunnel, right on schedule, his light caught the first tack. 1. He counted it out loud to himself, the way a tired man will, just to hear a voice in all that quiet. Then the second further up. 2. Then the third. 3. His boots finding the same soft ground they'd found coming down, his mind settling some, easing back from that low hum of worry that fog puts in a person. 4. 5. 5. Same as he'd pressed in, same as he expected. And that should have been the end of it. 5 tacks out, 5 tacks counted back, shelter just a short piece on. A sensible man, satisfied, would have kept walking the exact same line his boots already knew. But the fog does something to a man's eyes that it don't do to his feet. It makes him trust the light over the ground. And so when his headlamp, swinging just slightly wide as he stepped around a blowdown, caught a 6th glint, small, silver, low against a trunk deeper in the brush than any tack he recalled placing. He didn't think stranger. He thought I must have miscounted. Simple as that. A tired mind looking for the easiest answer. And the easiest answer is always the one that don't ask you to be afraid. So he turned off his own true path, the one his boots had already walked twice that night, and he followed that sixth glint instead. He'd tell himself in them first few steps that it was only a small correction, a few feet off his line, nothing more. Easy enough to fix once he touched a hand to that tack and confirmed it for what it was. That's how the mountain likes to do its asking. Never a shout, never a shove. Just a small, reasonable little detour that a tired man's mind is only too glad to grant. And that, friend, is the moment the mountain always waits for. The geometry of the thing shifted, quiet as a held breath. The laurel thicket that had been a wall on either side of a known trail become, in 3-4 steps, a wall on every side of no trail at all. The shelter, that solid, sensible, 3-sided shelter with its silver-gray logs and its promise of a wall against the wind, it didn't fade so much as it simply ceased being reachable. Swallowed whole into what I've come to call the unmapped void. That stretch of hollow that don't appear on any Forest Service map, that don't show up in any GPS track, that exists, best I can figure, only for as long as it takes to get a body good and lost in it. He kept walking toward that sixth silver point, because by then it was the only fixed thing left in a world gone soft and white and formless all around him. The fog pressed closer the deeper he went, till he could feel it against his face like a hand held just shy of touching him. And the glint, it didn't come no closer the way a tack ought to, steady and still, waiting on him to walk up to it. It seemed instead to be waiting on something else entire. When he'd closed the distance down to maybe 10 feet, he started to notice the shape of it wrong. A thumbtack throws back one small, hard point of light, flat and unblinking, same as a nail head or a bit of foil. This was thrown back 2 points, set a careful hand's width apart, same height as a man's face if that man was crouched low against the bark, watching. At 8 feet, he could see they weren't flat. They had a wetness to 'em, a glossy give, the kind of shine that don't come off metal but off something that's alive and blinking slow, catching the light and holding it a beat too long before letting it go. And even as he stood there, boots rooted, breath fogged out in front of him and joining the granddaddy fog like it belonged there now. Those two wet silver points turned, just slightly, just enough, to follow the sweep of his headlamp beam, the way an animal's eyes will follow a light in the dark. Except an animal generally has the good sense to also have a body attached. And this had bark behind it, and bark to either side of it, and no shape at all that a light could properly land on and call an animal. That's when they started sliding. Slow, awful slow, the way something moves when it has all the time God ever made and don't feel a need to rush a single second of it. Down the trunk, toward the forest floor, leaving behind 'em no track in the bark, no smear, no sign a body could point a flashlight at come morning and say, there, that's where it went. Just two wet silver eyes sinking down into the leaf litter and the granddaddy fog like they were being poured out of the tree itself. He didn't run. I want you to understand that part because it matters. A body will always figure, when it pictures a moment like that one, that they'd turn tail and bolt back the way they come. But the fog don't leave you a way you're certain of, and a man standing still in the granddaddy fog with his boots planting roots of their own will tell you after, if he's able to tell you anything at all, that running never once crossed his mind. Only watching. Only that same slow, cold need to see where the thing was headed, same as you'd watch water go down a drain, knowing full well you can't call it back up once it's started. And the last thing that hiker ever said out loud, near as anybody's been able to piece together, was that they'd stop blinking at him and started instead just to watch. Now, I've told this story a good many times to a good many folks huddled up round a fire or listening in the dark, same as you are now. And there's always somebody asks me, well, Abe, what happened to him? Where'd he end up? And the honest truth, friend, the only truth I've ever had to offer on this particular tale, is I don't rightly know. His pack was found 3 days on, still strung up neat under that 3-sided shelter, water bottles full, like he'd meant to come right back. There was 5 silver tacks pressed into 5 trees down along that spring path, exactly where a careful man would have left 'em. There wasn't no 6th. There never is, once the mountain's done counting for itself. Because that's the part I want to leave with you tonight, low and quiet, before you let your own eyes go heavy. Up here we've got a saying older than any map, older than any trail blaze painted white on a trunk. The mountain keeps track. It keeps track of every soul that walks it, every light a body sets down to find their way back, and every one of them small, sensible markers we press into the dark to prove to ourselves we won't get lost. Most nights that tracking is a kindness. It's a mountain remembering you, watching you home safe, same as I've watched hundreds home safe over these 70 years. But some nights, on a ridge swallowed in granddaddy fog thick enough to eat a man's own name right out of his mouth, that trackin' turns into something else. Something that adds one more marker of its own into your count, low in the laurel thicket, wet and patient and silver, just to see if you're paying close enough attention to notice which one of your lights was never really yours to begin with. So you go on and count your own 5 wherever you're laying tonight. Count 'em slow, count 'em careful. And if your tired eyes ever throw you back a 6th, you do what that boy didn't have the sense, or maybe just didn't have the years to do. You leave it be. You turn around. You walk home on the path your own boots already know. This has been Abe, up here on the ridge, same as always. And I'll see you next time the fog rolls in thick enough to talk through. Sleep easy now. Sleep slow. And don't go counting past 5. Don't move, son. Don't you move a muscle. There's something leaning down over the tin roof right now, not 2 foot above your head. And it is listening to see if you know it's there. I want you to hear this the way I heard it, told to me by a boy who lived, barely, and who never did sleep right again after. He was camped in an old 3-sided lean-to, the kind the Trail Service built back when the CCC boys still had calluses on their hands. And he made the one mistake every fool makes out there in the dark hollers. He got used to a sound. That right there. That dry, scraping hush against corrugated metal. He heard it, and his tired mind, Lord, it does this to all of us, his tired mind decided it was nothing. Decided it was just a dead limb swaying on some wind that wasn't blowing. And so he closed his eyes. He slowed his breath to sleep. That's when it started counting his breaths. Settle in now. Find yourself a comfortable position. Pull them blankets close as the static fades. 'Cause tonight we're opening a new case file from the Redacted Archives. And I promise you, You will listen to your own house different after this one. The trail guides, they'll warn you plenty. Look up before you lay down, they say. Mind the deadfall. Mind the leaners. Mind anything hanging loose in that canopy that logging men have called a Widowmaker since before your granddaddy's granddaddy swung an axe. But there's one thing them guidebooks never warn you about, and it's the thing that kills the careful ones same as the careless. They never warn you about the fatal error of trying to tune a sound out, of letting your breathing teach something in the dark exactly how fast it's allowed to come down on you. This is the story of the Widowmaker of Beulah Ridge. Get comfortable now. It's a cold one. His name don't matter much, so we'll just call him the hiker, like the old stories always did. He'd started that morning in first light, chasing 22 miles of the trail through a stretch of Appalachian wilderness so far off the beaten path that his phone hadn't shown a single bar since noon the day before. He was 3 days out from resupply, boots long since soaked through, and every step by that afternoon landed like he was stepping on somebody else's legs. Now, October up on that ridge don't play fair. The fog comes in low and blind, rolling up out the hollers like the mountain itself is exhaling. And it don't care one bit about a man's schedule. By 2 in the afternoon, that fog had swallowed him whole, white, thick, wet as a wrung-out rag, so heavy he couldn't see his own boots half the time. Just white in every direction, and the cold rock underfoot, slick with moss and old rain, trying its level best to put him on the ground. He went down onto one knee, hard, felt the cold soak clean through his pants, and for a moment, just a moment, something in him wanted to lay right there on that mountain and let the fog have him. But he was a stubborn sort, pulled himself up, kept walking, one hand out in front of him like a blind man in his own house, feeling for the world. That fog does something strange to a man's ears, too, not just his eyes. Every sound gets swallowed and thrown back different. So a squirrel scrambling through dead leaves 20 feet off sounds like footsteps right behind you. And a branch settling somewhere up in that gray canopy sounds like it's leaning down directly over your shoulder. He'd stopped twice already, heart hammering, turning in slow circles with his hands half raised, seeing nothing but white in every direction he faced. Each time he told himself it was nerves. Each time he kept walking, because there weren't another choice worth considering out there, not with dark closing in and the temperature already dragging itself down toward freezing. His pack straps had rubbed his shoulders raw hours back, and every breath he pulled in tasted of wet stone and rotten leaf mold. That particular cold mineral taste the mountain gets once autumn's got its teeth all the way in. His legs had gone past aching into something closer to numb. That dangerous kind of numb where a man stops trusting his own footing and starts trusting luck instead. Dusk don't announce itself gentle in that fog. It just arrives all at once, like somebody snuffed a candle in a room you didn't know you were in. And that's exactly when, half froze, half lost, aching in every joint a man's got, he saw it. A shape cutting through the white, squarish, solid, man-made, a shelter. Lord have mercy, a shelter. It was an old one, three-sided, hand-hewn logs gone silver-gray with age. A low tin roof rusted the color of dried blood in patches. The whole structure leaning just slightly on its foundation the way old things do when the ground itself has started to give up under 'em. There weren't no fourth wall, just open darkness facing out into the black wall of trees beyond. He didn't think twice. Couldn't afford to. He ducked in under that low roof, dropped his pack in the corner, and felt something in his chest unclench for the first time in 11 hours. He didn't notice, how could he, that just behind that shelter, half swallowed already by the tree line, stood one long dead trunk, bone white, bare of bark and patches, leaning at an angle that weren't quite natural, leaning the exact direction of that tin roof. And it had been leaning there, patient as stone, for longer than that shelter had stood. He dug through his pack in the last of the gray light, found a strip of jerky gone soft and salty, and chewed it slow, staring out at the wall of fog beyond the open face of the lean-to. Somewhere out past that white curtain, the sun was going down behind the ridgeline, though you'd never have known it to look. The light just dimmed by degrees, gray to grayer to black, till the tree line itself disappeared and there weren't nothing left to see at all. Only the shape of the shelter around him and the small, contained world of his own tired breathing. Now the forest at night has a voice, son. Crickets, an owl somewhere off calling to nobody, the small shuffling things that move under leaves. But that night, up on Beulah Ridge, all of it just stopped. No wind, no insects, no owl. Just a cold, deep, listening kind of quiet. The sort of quiet that don't feel empty so much as it feels occupied. The hiker didn't think much of it right off. Exhaustion has a way of making a man deaf to warnings his own gut is trying to give him. He worked himself down into his winter mummy bag, that cocoon of nylon and goose down, zipped it high up under his chin against the granddaddy cold that settles deep into your joints up on that ridge come autumn. He lay there in the dark, aching, grateful, already halfway down into sleep. And that's when the sound started. A dry scrape, slow, deliberate, running clean across that corrugated tin roof from one edge toward the other, like something heavy dragging its knuckles across it real careful-like. He opened his eyes in the dark, listened. Nothing. Just his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Then it come again. His mind. And I want you to understand this is the same thing your mind would do. Same thing mine would do. His mind went hunting for an explanation it could live with. A branch, he told himself. Just a dead branch resting against the roof, moving on a breeze. Never mind that the air outside hadn't stirred a single leaf in an hour. Never mind that there weren't a whisper of wind to be had. The mind wants an answer bad enough, it'll build one out of nothing at all. Just wood, he whispered to himself. Just barely above a breath. Just an old dead branch. He closed his eyes again. Told himself the oldest lie a tired man tells himself in the dark. That if he don't look at it, it ain't real. That if he just breathes slow, breathes even, lets his tired body do what it's begging to do, the sound will just fold itself into the background of the night same as everything else does. That right there, son, that's a mistake. That's the one they never put in the guidebooks. A body can walk 22 miles through blinding fog and come out the other side just fine. A body can slip on wet stone and catch itself. Can go hungry a day longer than it planned. Can shiver through a granddaddy cold that settles deep into the joints and still wake up breathing. But a mind that decides to stop paying attention, that's the one thing out there in them dark hollers that can't ever be undone once it's done. He forced his breath down long and slow, the way you do falling off to sleep. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. Tuning the world out, one measured breath at a time. Telling himself over and over, it's nothing, it's nothing, it's nothing. He didn't notice, not yet, that the sound was starting to match him, timing itself, learning him. It was somewhere past midnight when the pattern finally broke through his half-sleep. And once a man notices a thing like that, son, he cannot unnotice it. Cannot ever again. He was drawn in a slow breath, and right on the tail end of his inhale, the wood groaned. One long, low, structural groan, like a tree bearing weight it weren't built to bear. Then he let his breath out, slow and even, and on that exhale he heard the scrape again, that dry bark dragging, and this time it sounded closer. His eyes come open in the pitch black. His whole body went rigid inside that sleeping bag. He held his breath, testing something he didn't want to believe was true. Nothing. No groan, no scrape. The whole holler waking right along with him. He let the breath out, slow, controlled, and the scrape came again, precise, time to the second, closer than before. Now I want you to understand what that shelter had felt like when he crawled into it. Wide open on that fourth side, plenty of room, sky visible clear past the roofline. But something had changed in the geometry of that space while he lay there trying not to notice. It had gotten smaller, tighter, like the darkness itself had leaned in closer to listen along with him. He turned his head, slow as a man moving under water, and looked toward the open face of that shelter. And there it was. The dead white trunk that had been standing patient in the tree line was not standing in the tree line no more. It had come forward. It leaned now clean across the open face of the lean-to, its bone-pale bark inches, son, above where his boots lay at the foot of his sleeping bag, and creeping closer with every one of his own exhales, matched breath for breath, patient as winter itself. He was paralyzed, truly paralyzed, the way a rabbit goes still under a hawk's shadow, believing, foolish as it is, that stillness might be the same thing as safety. Zipped up tight in that mummy bag, arms pinned at his sides, he could do nothing but stare upward into the dark. His mind, racing now, went scrambling back through every childhood tale he'd ever half listened to and dismissed. Every old-timer's warning he'd smiled politely at and forgotten the moment he'd shouldered his pack. He understood, all at once and far too late, why the trail markers up on that stretch of ridge were spaced closer together than anywhere else on the mountain, and why the local outfitters never did stock that section on their recommended maps. He understood, with a cold certainty that settled into his chest heavier than the winter air itself, that he was not the first fool to make camp under that particular stretch of tree line, and that he would not be remembered as the last. And that's when he saw the eyes. 2 knotholes, high in that ancient dead timber, wide set and hollow and staring straight down at him. Knotholes that any daylight-eyed man would have called just knotholes. Just the natural scarring of old wood. But in that dark, time to his breath, leaning lower with every exhale he gave it, they did not look natural at all. They looked wide-set, patient, awake. He wanted to scream, couldn't find the breath to do it. And that, son, that right there, was the second mistake. Because a scream, even a small one, is still a breath. And a breath is still a rhythm. And rhythm is the only thing that entity had ever needed from him. There weren't no thrashing fight to speak of, son. No chase through the dark timber. No wild scramble for a knife or a flashlight. Whatever that thing was, it didn't want a struggle. It only ever wanted stillness. And by then, it had all the stillness it could ask for. He told me, the boy who lived, the one who carried this story down off that mountain, that the smell come first, before anything else. A cold, dry, freezing kind of scent. Like a woodpile left out through a hard winter. Like sap gone to ice 100 years back. It filled up that little shelter till there weren't no other air left to breathe. And it was the smell, more than the sight of it, that finally let him understand what he was lying under. The scraping stopped. It had gotten as close as it needed to get. And now it was only listening, waiting on the very last thing it required of him. Same as it had been waiting on him from the first breath he drew in that shelter. One more slow, even, trusting exhale, so it would know, for certain and for sure, exactly when to come the rest of the way down. He didn't give it that breath, son. Not that night. Somewhere in him, past the fear, past the cold, he found the one thing that thing hadn't accounted for. A breath broke wrong on purpose, ragged, uneven, a gasp, sharp and sudden, that carried no rhythm at all for it to read. And in that half a second of confusion, that's when he moved. Threw himself sideways out from under that leaning trunk, sleeping bag and all, rolling out into the black, wet dark past the shelter's open edge. And he did not stop moving till the gray light of morning found him 3 miles down that ridge, huddled under a rock overhang, shaking so hard he couldn't hold a canteen steady. They tell me when the rangers finally went up to that lean-to, weeks later, following his report, there weren't no dead tree leaning against it at all. Just an old shelter, standing quiet in the tree line, same as it had for 60 years. No Widowmaker in sight. That's the way of it, son, near as I can tell. It don't leave a mark for daylight eyes to find. It only ever leaves a memory, and a man who don't sleep quite so deep anymore. But son, you go on and remember this the next time you're bedded down somewhere quiet, somewhere with a roof over your head and a sound you can't quite place scratching at the edges of your hearing. You remember that the mountain don't forget a rhythm once it's learned it. And you remember the fatal mistake weren't never about hearing that sound in the first place. It was about teaching it your breath. Now go on and get your rest, son. Sleep however comes natural to you. Just maybe don't breathe too even tonight. The stones, they're wrong. They're wrong, and I know it now, and I can hear it. That sound coming through the gray. Clack, clack, slow and patient. Someone is out there in the fog, building something in the dark, and I cannot see them. I cannot move. I do not know which way is down anymore. Let me tell you how I got here. There is a place in these old mountains. You know the kind of place I mean, I think, even if you have never stood in it, where the trees simply stop, not thin out, not gradually open. They stop all at once, like something agreed among themselves not to go any further. Above the tree line there is nothing. No canopy, no shelter, only sky and rock and the slow, cold wind that never quite rests up on those high, bald ridges. The wind up here does not gust the way it does down in the valleys. It is a steady, constant pressure, leaning, like something very large pressing a hand against your chest and holding it there. I had been hiking since early morning, 6 hours, maybe 7. My legs knew it. My back knew it. My feet had gone past aching into a kind of quiet numbness 2 miles back, which is the point where your body simply accepts the demand you are making of it. The trail had been long and patient with me, winding up through the hardwoods, through the laurel thickets, through the switchbacks that fold back on themselves just to remind you how small you are. By the time I broke through the tree line and felt the first real wind against my face, the light had already begun to go. Not dark, not yet. Just that slow, amber dimming that settles in when the sun drops behind the ridgeline across the valley. That bruised, golden kind of light that makes everything look older than it is. Older and quieter. like the world exhaling at the end of a very long day. The bald stretched out ahead of me, pale grass, straw-colored and pressed flat by the wind, spreading across a wide dome of exposed rock and thin earth. No blazes up here, no painted marks on the rock, no signage of any kind. Above the tree line you follow the cairns. If you have never hiked a high bald before, let me tell you what a cairn is. It is a stack of stones, 3, 4, 5 rocks balanced deliberately on top of one another, usually knee-high, placed every 50 to 100 yards along the route. They are the only language the mountain speaks to you up here. They say, "Here, walk here. This is the way." Without them, on a clear day, you can navigate by landmark, by the shape of the ridgeline, by the distant profile of a known peak. But when the fog comes in, and on these old mountains the fog always comes in, without those stones, you are lost, not a little turned around, not merely confused, the kind of loss that becomes something permanent, the kind that people who search for you later talk about in low voices in the parking lot of the ranger station while the dogs rest. I knew the fog was coming before it arrived. You can smell it up here before you can see it. A cold mineral smell, like a wet stone pulled from a creek bed, like deep water brought suddenly up into dry air. It smells like the inside of the mountain, if the mountain had a throat. I reckoned I had maybe 20 minutes of good visibility left, and the next shelter was 2 miles along the ridge. 2 miles on a bald I had done before. I trusted the cairns. I had no reason not to. Not yet. I started walking. The first cairn sat right at the edge of the grass where the bare rock begins. Pale granite, dry and familiar. Knee-high, stacked flat, the way experienced hands stack them. I touched it the way I always do, just to feel the cool weight of it under my palm, just to let it remind me that someone else had stood right here at some other time and thought about me standing here without ever knowing me. They had lifted these rocks. They had made decisions about which stone would bear the weight of the others. They had walked away not knowing who would be grateful for the work. Trail maintenance is a kind of quiet faith. You build for strangers you will never meet, in weather you will never see, for a darkness you will not be there to witness. I moved on. The fog came slower than I expected, rising from the valleys on both sides of the ridge simultaneously, filling the low places first. For a while I could see it gathering below me on both sides, like gray water rising in a wide bowl. There was still open sky directly above, that deep fading blue that comes right after the gold drains out of evening. Up above, a single star had appeared. Just the one, faint and steady, and I marked it and was glad of it. The second cairn was a little shorter. I noticed it, but did not mark it as important. Cairns vary. People build them differently. Some people stack them high. Some people use many small stones. Some use only a few large ones. The shape of a cairn is a kind of signature in a way, and no two hands build them quite the same. The third one gave me the first feeling. Not a thought, not yet a conclusion, just a feeling. The way a familiar room can feel wrong before you understand the reason, before you can name what has changed. I stopped in front of it and I looked at it, and I did not move for a long moment. The fog had reached me by then. It moved around my legs first, slow and cold, the way it always does, finding the low places before it takes the rest. The stones were wet, not damp, wet, dark with it, slicked with something the color of creek-bottom mud, that particular dark reddish brown, the color of stones that have sat in moving water for a very long time. The kind of sediment that builds up slowly, over years, on rocks that never fully dry out. The kind that belongs in a shaded hollow beside a running stream, deep below the ridge, where the sun never reaches long enough to do its work. I was standing on a high bald, wind-swept, bone-dry. The nearest water source was at least 600 feet below me in elevation. There was no earthly reason for creek mud on these stones. I looked at my hands. I had touched the first cairn with an open palm. My fingertips were clean and pale. I did not touch this one. I told myself it was nothing. Trail crews come up from unusual angles sometimes. Maybe someone had hiked in from the West Hollow, where there is a creek, and handled the stones with muddy hands. That is a thing that could happen. People are careless. People track mud. I told myself that was all it was. And I kept walking, and the fog settled around my shoulders like something being laid down gently from above. The fourth cairn was shorter still, and the distance between the third and the fourth felt closer than it should have been. In the fog, your sense of distance does something unreliable. Things become simultaneously closer and farther than they ought to be. Your depth perception gets lazy, confused by the gray sameness of everything around you. I told myself the spacing was fine. I told myself a great many things in those few minutes, and I almost believed most of them. The fifth one I nearly walked past entirely. It was barely knee-high, and it sat slightly downhill of where I expected it, off to my left. I stopped. I pulled out my phone, opened my offline maps, and squinted at the topography lines through the dimming light. The trail was supposed to run along the ridge spine, relatively flat for another half-mile at least, not descending, not this soon. The descent was still ahead. The trail did not drop yet. But the cans were pulling me left, and left on this ridge was down. I looked behind me. I could still see the pale shape of the fourth cairn in the mist, maybe 30 yards back. Still there, still visible. I breathed slowly. I turned back to the fifth stone, and I studied it for a long moment. The mud was darker here, almost black in the gray failing light. The rocks were larger at the base, smaller at the crown. Proper construction. It looked right. It looked like something built with genuine intention and real care. That was the part that bothered me most about it. It was not haphazard. It was not a pile thrown together carelessly by a bored day hiker who wanted to leave a mark. It was deliberate, practiced. The work of hands that had stacked stone many, many times. The work of hands that knew exactly what they were doing and had never once hurried. I put my palm on the top stone. Something shifted beneath it. Not the top stone alone, something deeper. I felt it through the whole stack, a slow, grinding looseness, like a stone rocking in the socket it has occupied for a very long time. I pulled my hand back quickly. I bent down and looked more carefully at the base, and that is when I saw it. Wedged under the lowest and largest stone, sealed beneath it, anchored under its full, settled weight, was the toe of a boot. Worn brown leather, cracked across the toe box. The laces were gone or had rotted away long ago. The kind of boot that had been a good boot once, in the way that things are good before enough time gets to them. Old and patient-looking, the way abandoned things look patient, the way they look like they have accepted whatever has come. The stone was not resting beside it. The stone was on top of it, holding it down against the earth. I stood very still for a long time. The fog moved past me in slow, soundless ribbons. It did not care what I was looking at. The cold did not care. Nothing on that mountain cared what I was in the slow process of understanding. First in my body, the way understanding always arrives first in the body, then in my mind, then in some quieter and older part of me that has no useful name and never needed one. I turned around. I was going back. Whatever waited at the end of this line of stones, I had no interest in meeting it tonight or any other night. I would retrace my steps to the tree line, find the shelter on the far side of the ridge in the morning, and be out by first light. Simple, possible, safe. I walked back toward where the fourth cairn had stood. It was not there. I stopped. I looked left. I looked right. The fog was thick now. Genuinely, completely thick. The kind you feel pressing against the skin of your face. The kind with weight to it. Visibility was down to maybe 15 feet in any direction. But 15 feet was enough. The fourth cairn had been 30 yards behind me. I should have been able to see it clearly. I walked to where it had stood, and I crouched down, and I swept my hands through the pale grass. Nothing. No stones, no scraped earth, no depression in the soil where the base stones had settled. As though nothing had ever been built there at all. As though the ground had simply absorbed it, quietly, while I was not watching. I stood up, and I turned the slow, full circle, and I counted the cairns visible through the gray. One to my left, one directly ahead, one to my right and slightly downhill. Wherever I turned, there were stones, stacked dark and deliberate, wet with mud that had no right to be here. Everywhere I looked, a path was being offered, and not one of them was the path I had walked in on. I tried the compass on my phone. It gave me north, and I turned to face it and walked, calming my steps carefully, and after 40 steps I found myself at another cairn, lower than my knee, squatting in the grass like something watchful. Beyond it, barely visible, the suggestion of another. Always another. Always just far enough to require one more step forward into the gray. I stopped following. I stood still. And in the stillness, I heard it. Clack. A long pause, longer than felt natural. Clack. Stone on stone. A sound that any hiker knows. That specific, hollow, clean percussion of a rock being lifted and placed with deliberate hands. It came from somewhere ahead and slightly to my left. 20 feet, maybe 30. In thick fog, that distance is a country all its own. Clack. Slow. Unhurried. Whatever was making that sound was not alarmed by my presence. It was not startled, not frantic, not hurrying to finish before I arrived. It had all the time in the world. It knew it had all the time in the world. It was not hiding that fact from me. I lowered my headlamp beam. I have learned in dark places that you do not throw light forward without preparation. You want to see what is ahead before it fully understands that you are seeing it. I lowered the beam until it barely skimmed the surface of the grass, lighting only the ground at my own feet. And then I raised it, slowly, very slowly. The figure was kneeling. That was the first thing I registered. It was on its knees in the dirt, and even kneeling it was far too tall. The proportions were wrong in the specific way that things are wrong when your mind has no frame in which to file them. Long, very pale, the joints, the elbows, the knuckles, the wide knees pressed into the earth, with a color and apparent texture of exposed limestone, gray-white and swollen-looking, hard as things shaped by deep water over a very, very long time. The hands were lifting a rock, a large one. They lifted it with the ease you or I might lift a book from a shelf, and they set it on top of a growing stack, and they adjusted it with one slow, precise, unhurried motion. And then the long head tilted, a patient, deliberate tilt, like listening for something only it could hear. And when the stone settled into its final resting place, it made that sound. Clack. It did not look at me. It did not need to. Whatever it was, it already understood exactly where I was standing. It had always known. I took one step back. My boot heel pressed into the pale grass, and I heard it beneath me, felt it through my soul, a faint grind against the earth. I looked down. A stone had appeared at my heel, small, flat, pale as old bone, the way things surface when they are done waiting. I stepped back again. 2 stones now, side by side, arranged with the same quiet precision as everything else on this ridge. I understood it then. The way you understand certain things all at once, completely, with no room left for bargaining or for taking it back. Every step I took backward, every inch of ground I surrendered, the mountain gave that thing exactly what it needed. The path was not somewhere behind me, waiting to be found. The path was being assembled from me, from the space I was willing to give up, from the ground I was retreating into step by step in the dark. The fog thickened around that pale, kneeling shape. It did not stop. It did not look up. The sound came again through the gray, patient and certain and close. Clack. Don't move. In a dark place, on a high place, with the fog pressing in close from every direction, you stand still. You breathe slow and you breathe even. You give nothing away. You do not let it know which direction you intend to go. Because maybe, if you are very careful and very quiet, you still have somewhere left to go. You close your eyes. You listen to the mountain breathe around you in the dark. And you hope, in that small and wordless part of you, that the path being built all around you has not yet been finished, that it is not even now already complete. Don't move the light. Whatever you do, child, don't move that light up off its face. Well now, settle on in. Pull that blanket up under your chin. Let your shoulders go soft, and let that old static finish fading on out of your ears. You're safe here, in the dark, with me. My name's Silas Vance. Some folks round the holler just call me Abe. And I've spent the better part of my life walking ridge lines that don't rightly want to be walked, listening to things that don't rightly want to be heard. Tonight I'm going to tell you about a young hiker, a solo wanderer who took to the Appalachian spine for the quiet of it, the solitude, the kind of silence that's supposed to heal a tired mind. It did not heal him. This happened on a stretch of ridge so far back in the high country that the maps just call it unmaintained. Late autumn, the kind of cold that creeps in under your collar slow, the way a secret does. He'd started that morning under a pale, indifferent sky, but by early afternoon the fog had rolled up out of the valley like the mountain itself was exhaling, thick and wet and the color of an old bruise. It pressed down on him, sat heavy on his shoulders. Every step up that switchback felt like dragging a sled of river stones, his pack straps cutting grooves into muscles that had long since stopped complaining and started simply aching, deep and dull, in that way that tells you your body is running on fumes and stubbornness alone. The trail narrowed as the light died. Rhododendron thickets clawed at his sleeves. Roots, slick with the day's drizzle, reached up out of the dark earth like they were trying to trip him, to keep him out there just a little longer than was safe. And the rain, oh, it had been coming down soft and fine since noon. But as dusk swallowed the ridge whole, it turned into something heavier, steady, relentless. A cold, percussive downpour that found every gap in his jacket and turned his fingers to stiff, clumsy things. By the time true dark settled over that ridge, he'd lost all sense of distance, the way a body does when fatigue starts whispering louder than reason. Every fallen log looked the same as the last. His headlamp, still dim then, just a low yellow glow bobbing along the wet trail, caught nothing but more black trunks, more glistering leaves, more of that endless gray fog rolling through the hemlocks like it had nowhere better to be. He thought more than once of just stopping right there on the trail, curling up against a tree till morning. That's how tired does it to a man. Makes foolish ideas sound reasonable. But something kept his legs moving. Some old stubborn instinct that knows the difference between resting and quitting. He told himself just one more bend, just one more rise. And then, there it was. A three-sided lean-to, weathered gray, its old wood soft with rot at the corners, sitting tucked into a stand of hemlocks like the mountain had grown it there itself. A rusted tin roof, streaked dark with age and water stains, the kind that hums under rain like a held note that never quite resolves. He near wept at the sight of it. Lord, the relief of a roof, even half a roof, even a roof open clean on one side to the wide black night. He hauled himself up onto the worn wooden platform, shrugged free of his pack, and felt that particular gratitude that only comes to a body that's pushed itself past where it wanted to go. He laid out his bag, heavy, synthetic-filled, built for winter nights just like this one, and he zipped himself down into it, slow, savoring the way the warmth gathered round him, the way the rain on tin became a lullaby instead of a threat. The shelter was old, see? Built decades back by hands long since stilled. The kind of structure the Forest Service forgets to maintain, and the mountain quietly reclaims, inch by inch, year by year. Its roof joists ran low, awful low, maybe 4 feet above where a grown man's chest would rest, laying flat. He didn't think much on that. Why would he? Most folks don't think on the architecture of safety until something makes them. He propped his boots near the open side, let the rain hiss against the toes of them, and watched the dark beyond the shelter's edge the way a man watches a fire, half mesmerized, half just glad of something to look at besides the inside of his own tired skull. He found himself thinking, in that loose and drifting way exhaustion allows, about how quiet a mountain truly is once you stop fighting it. How a ridge at midnight holds a stillness that feels almost sacred, almost watchful, like the land itself is holding its breath right alongside you. He didn't know yet how right that feeling was. For an hour, maybe 2, there was nothing but that rain, that low, drumming, endless rain, and the particular black of a ridge at midnight, where even the moon's been swallowed whole by cloud. He drifted toward sleep the way a man drifts toward the edge of a dock, slow, unaware, content. And then he heard it, a scratch, soft, up in the rafters, right above where his head lay. He didn't move, Didn't even open his eyes proper. Mice, he thought. Field mice, nesting up in the old insulation, disturbed maybe by the warmth of his breath rising up off the sleeping bag. Common enough thing in a shelter this old. He'd heard worse on other nights. Porcupines under floorboards, raccoons in the eaves. This was nothing. This was nature doing what nature does in places like this, indifferent to him entirely. It came again and again, a patient little rhythm, scratch, 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 scratch. He let his breathing slow, the way you do when you're trying to coax your own body back toward sleep. And the scratching slowed with him. Now, child, I want you to sit with that a moment, same as he did. Though he didn't understand it the way we're going to understand it together right now, safe and warm where we are. Mice don't pace themselves to a man's lungs. Mice don't listen. He told himself it was coincidence. He told himself a great many comforting things, the way the mind does when it's half asleep and unwilling to climb the awful staircase of a darker truth. But the scratching kept time with him. Breath in, pause, scratch. Breath out, pause, scratch. Over and over, a rhythm too exact, too patient, too aware to belong to anything small and blind and simply nesting. He should have just let it be, but he didn't. He was tired and cold and curious. In that particular way, exhaustion makes a man curious, reckless almost, like the part of his brain that knew better had gone to sleep ahead of the rest of him. So he reached one stiff arm up out of the warm dark of his bag, fumbled for the headlamp resting on the floor beside him, clicked it on, thumbed it up to its highest, brightest setting, and he turned the light straight up into the rafters. For one breath, one single suspended breath, there was only the white wash of the headlamp beam against old gray wood. Cobwebs, a scatter of dead leaves blown in through some forgotten gap. Nothing. He almost laughed at himself. Almost. Because that's when his eyes adjusted to the brightness, and the shape that had been hiding in plain sight pressed so flat and so still against the cold tin that it had looked at first glance like just another shadow among shadows. That shape resolved itself into something his mind did not want to receive. It was long, longer than a man has any right being, wedged horizontal between two narrow roof beams not 18 inches apart, its frame somehow flattened, compressed, folded into a space far too small for the sheer wrongness of its length. Gray skin, the color of river clay left out too long in winter, stretched tight and thin over a frame that bent in places a frame should never bend, elbows that ran the wrong direction, a spine that curved twice where a spine should curve once. Its joints made a sound, a soft, wet poppin', slow and rhythmic, like knuckles cracking deep underwater, as it held its impossible body pressed flush against the crossbeams, perfectly parallel, perfectly still, like it had practiced being still for longer than he'd been alive. And its eyes, Lord, its eyes were open, wide, glassy, the kind of black on black you see in a still pond at midnight. No white to 'em at all, pointed straight down into the beam of his headlamp, straight down into him. It had been there the whole time, 4 feet above his face, watching him fall asleep, watching him breathe. He could not move. And I do not mean that as a manner of speaking, child. I mean his body, his arms, his legs, his whole tired frame was zipped tight down into that heavy winter mummy bag, the kind built snug round the shoulders to trap a body's heat, the kind that turns a man into something close to a chrysalis. He could wiggle his fingers. He could shift his hips an inch, maybe 2. That was the whole of his freedom in that moment. 2 inches of give inside a nylon shell, a headlamp clutched in one stiff hand, and something ancient and wrong hanging 4 feet above his chest, staring down the beam of light like it was waiting on him to blink first. It did not lunge. It did not screech. It did not do any of the things his racing mind in its animal terror half expected and almost wished for, because at least a lunge would be over quick. Instead, it simply watched, patient, utterly, impossibly patient, the way only something that has waited in dark rafters for far longer than a single human lifetime can be patient. He understood, somewhere down in the oldest part of his brain, the part that still remembers being prey, exactly what it was doing. It was waiting on the batteries. Headlamp batteries don't last forever, child. And it knew that. It knew that better than he did. He didn't dare look away from it to check the little battery indicator down at the base of the lamp. He didn't dare blink longer than he had to. Every second that light stayed bright and steady on that gray, glassy-eyed face was a second it stayed pinned up there against the beams, frozen, held in place by nothing more than the thin, fragile mercy of illumination. Time stopped meaning anything in any ordinary sense. There was only the rain on tin, steady as a heartbeat slowing down. There was only the cold tightening its grip on the shelter, a cold that seemed to deepen the longer that thing hung there, unmoving, 4 feet above his trapped and straining body. There was only the small, terrible math running in the back of his skull. How many hours till dawn? How many minutes of battery left? Which one would run out first? And then, slow as a held breath, finally letting go, he watched the mist begin. It came from its mouth, or what passed for a mouth anyhow. A thin, gray scene that had been closed this whole time, and now was opening, just a fraction, letting loose a slow, curling breath of cold, pale vapor that drifted downward through the beam of light, like smoke sinking instead of rising, against every law that smoke ought to obey. The mist touched his face first, cold, colder than the autumn night around him, colder than the rain, a cold that seemed to settle directly into his chest, into the marrow, into whatever quiet animal part of him still remembered what it meant to be afraid of the dark. His headlamp beam blurred, softened, the light scattering through that slow gray fog until the creature above him became less a shape and more a suggestion, a darker patch within the haze, still watching, still patient, still perfectly parallel to them old crossbeams. And that was when the arm began to move. One long, pale limb, folded tight along its side this whole endless night, began with a soft and terrible series of wet popping joints to unbend, slowly, almost gently, if such a word could ever belong to something like this. Elbow first, bend in the wrong direction, then forearm, then a hand with too many joints in each long gray finger, reaching downward through that drifting mist, downward through the thinning beam of failing light, downward toward the trapped and helpless shape zipped tight into that winter bag below. He could not move his legs to kick free. He could not move his arms enough to do anything but grip that headlamp tighter, watch that flickering beam, watch the battery indicator finally dip toward red. He could only lie there, swallowed in cold mist, listening to the slow, wet popping of an arm that had waited in darkness for longer than memory, reaching for him with the patience of stone. I won't tell you what happened next, child, not because I don't know, but because some things are better left folding themselves quietly back into the dark, the way that mist eventually folded back up into them rafters, the way that headlamp eventually, inevitably, flickered and dimmed and went still. What I can tell you is this. They found his pack at that shelter 3 days later. His bag, zipped tight, empty. And up in them low rafters, wedged between the beams, something had left a mark in the dust. Something long. Something that had been lying there a real long while. The search party noted other things, too. Things that didn't make the official report. A smell up under that tin roof, cold and mineral, like wet stone in deep winter. Deep scratches in the old crossbeams, the kind that don't come from claws so much as from fingers, pressing into the same worn grooves night after night, for longer than any ranger could account for. But shelters like that one dot the whole spine of these mountains, child. Hundreds of them. Quiet, three-sided, half-forgotten, with low rafters built by men who never thought to wonder what else might find that gap a comfortable place to wait. So here's my counsel to you, drifter. On whatever ridge or rooftop or quiet room you're resting your head tonight, if something scratches above you in the dark, and it slows when you slow, and it breathes when you breathe, don't reach for the light. Some things up in the rafters are better left believed to be mice. Stay close to your fires, friends. Stay low on open ridges after dark. And stay safe in the hollows. There's someone sitting on the edge of the shelter platform, right there, at the lip of the wood, just sitting in the rain, not shaking off the water, not unbuckling anything, not making a single sound except talking in my voice, my actual voice, the same flat O I've had my whole life, the stutter I get when I'm worn thin. It said it was cold. It said it remembered the birches from this morning, the ones with a scar shaped like a door. And I never told a soul about those birches. I have to stay still. I have to stay perfectly, absolutely, completely still. Settle in. Pull the blankets close and let the static fade as we journey into the deepest, unmapped hollows of the mountains. Welcome back to the Redacted Archives. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over the high ridgeline in the last week of October, a quiet so total and so weighted that you begin to feel it pressing against the inside of your chest like cold river water slowly rising. I had been walking for 11 days. 11 days alone on a remote stretch of trail where the blazes had faded to the color of old bone, and the undergrowth had grown so thick that the path itself felt less like a trail cut through wilderness and more like a wound the mountain had never chosen to heal. My pack sat heavy between my shoulder blades. 53 pounds of everything a body needs and nothing more. And my boots had soaked through on day 3 and never truly dried again. The sky by mid-afternoon had gone the color of a fresh bruise. Not ordinary autumn gray, but something deeper. A purple-green dark that pressed down against the ridgeline like a hand laid flat against a wound. The temperature had been dropping since noon. I could feel it in my knuckles, in the thin skin over my cheekbones, in the way my breath moved out ahead of me in thick, reluctant curls. The trail map showed nothing useful for at least 7 more miles. No shelter markers, no lean-to symbols, no fire roads. Just contour lines pressed so tightly together they looked like the whorls of a fingerprint, and a vast, unnamed stretch of dark green. There is a thing older hikers will tell you, if you find them at the right hour beside the right kind of fire, their voices low and careful the way certain kinds of knowledge demand. They call it the rule of the ridge, and it is simply this. When the white-out fog drops low enough to swallow the roots beneath your boots, not your ankles, not your knees, but the very roots, the very ground, you stop walking. You do not push on. You do not trust the nearest blaze or convince yourself the slope ahead is anything like the grade you walked this morning. You stop, and you find walls, any walls at all, and you get inside them. Because in that fog, in that mountain dark, the trail no longer belongs to you. Something older than cartography has quietly reclaimed it. The fog came down at 4:15. The light died so suddenly and so completely I thought for one terrible second something had gone wrong with my eyes. One moment the trail was there ahead of me, pale and brown through the timber. Then the cloud descended, unhurried, like a curtain drawn from far above, and the roots beneath my boots disappeared, and I stopped walking. The temperature dropped 11 degrees in 20 minutes. The first fat, cold drops of rain tapped against my rain jacket almost patiently. I left the trail. I pushed east through skeletal rhododendron thickets that dragged cold fingers across my face, through stands of second-growth hemlock where the needle mat swallowed my footsteps whole, following the slope down into the hollow below the ridgeline where the wind died and the cold pooled, and the fog sat so thickly between the trunks that each tree appeared and dissolved like a thought you cannot hold. And then I smelled it. Old char, old wood, old iron. The particular scent of a structure that human beings have sheltered inside for a very long time. 10,000 small fires, 10,000 damp jackets. 10,000 long nights with rain hammering overhead. The shelter materialized out of the fog the way a word surfaces when you've been searching for it. 3 walls of stacked chestnut log. Gone so dark with age, the wood looked less like timber and more like something the mountain had simply grown that way. The roof was corrugated tin, so old and oxidized the rust had healed over itself into rough beauty. The platform floor, wide warped planks rising 18 inches from the earth, was empty. No trail register, no bear box, no fire ring, no name carved anywhere. Just the 3 walls and the roof, and the dark hollow closing in on all sides. I pressed my palms flat against the platform wood and felt the depth of it. The years worked into the grain, the moisture of 100 seasons absorbed until the boards felt less like wood and more like the memory of wood. I checked the walls for gaps, checked the angle of the overhang against the wind. The structure was old but sound, and I was going to be alive in the morning. I unclipped my pack and let it drop to the planks with a sound like a tired body finally sitting down. Making camp inside a 3-sided shelter at the front edge of a hard mountain storm is a ritual that leaves very little room for thought, which I have always believed is entirely by design. The hands need something to do. The mind needs the immediate and the concrete so that it does not drift toward the larger questions the mountains tend to raise in a person left too long alone in them. I hung the small tarp across the open face of the shelter, staked at the corners with trekking poles pushed into the soft earth below. I set the camp stove on the platform boards, a small backpacking unit that clicks to life with a soft brew hiss. Balanced the titanium pot of filtered water on the burner and stripped off my soaked outer layers while I waited. Rain jacket, wet soft shell, damp base layer. I hung them on the small, square-headed iron nails driven into the back wall. Hand-cut nails, I noticed. Old enough to say something about this place that I did not quite want to hear. I pulled on the dry thermal layer I'd kept sealed in a waterproof stuff sack for exactly this kind of night. And the warmth of it against my cold skin was so sudden that I exhaled slowly with the relief of something fundamental being restored. The water boiled. I ate a freeze-dried meal that tasted of the concept of food rather than food itself, and watched the rain beyond the tarp thicken until the individual drops were no longer visible, and the world became a single, seamless gray wall that had replaced everything else. When I was finished, I packed the stove and pot away and sat for a moment in the pure, thunderous dark, listening to the rain on the tin roof with a feeling that was almost peace. Then I unrolled the sleeping bag, a heavy down mummy bag rated to -20 degrees, a cocoon of warmth that climbing into felt less like going to sleep and more like going somewhere else entirely. I eased myself inside, drew the cinch cords tight at the hood until only a narrow oval of open air remained around my face, and slowly drew the zipper upward, from hip to chin, sealing the cold out, pulling the storm flap over the zipper teeth, and lying back against the sleeping pad in the accumulating warmth of my own body. The rain hammered the tin roof with a sound like continuous applause. The world beyond the top was an absolute seamless black. I closed my eyes. I was nearly asleep, right at that dissolving edge where the surface of consciousness becomes water, and you are just beginning to slip beneath it. When I heard the footsteps, they were heavy and slow, coming from the north side of the hollow where the thickets were densest. They moved through the mud with a soft, rhythmic squelching, the specific sound of a boot heel pressing into saturated earth and pulling free again, approaching with the unhurried certainty of something that already knows where it is going. I had pulled the zipper to my chin. I lay still. The footsteps reached the platform edge and stopped. For a long moment there was only the rain, enormous on the roof above me, and the interior darkness of the shelter, and my own heartbeat, which I became suddenly and acutely aware of in the way you only become aware of your heartbeat when it is relevant information. Then the platform boards shifted with a low wooden groan, and a considerable weight settled onto the lip of the platform at the open front edge of the shelter. I could see its outline through the gap at the bottom of the top. Sitting with its back to me, facing out into the driving rain, rounded shoulders, hands resting on its knees, the silhouette of a rain jacket, dark pants, boots, a pack frame, entirely, completely human in its shape. It did not shake the water off. It did not unbuckle its hip belt or shrug its pack loose or reach for a headlamp. It simply sat at the platform's edge, facing the storm. And it was still in a way that no person arriving out of an hour's hiking in hard rain and mountain dark is ever still. Not the stillness of exhaustion or of catching one's breath. The stillness of something that has no breath to catch. I did not move. I watched through my lashes in the flat dark. The figure sat for perhaps 4 minutes without speaking. The rain fell. The tin roof continued its enormous hypnotic roar. And then it spoke. The voice that came out of it was mine, not like mine. Not an approximation or a studied resemblance. Mine. The precise, flat vowels of the mid-state accent I had spent 31 years developing. The slight drag on consonants that surfaces when I am cold and tired. The soft hesitation, barely a stutter, a brief doubling of the first syllable, that appears when I have been alone for more than a week and my social machinery begins to rust. My voice coming from a body that was not mine. It said it was cold, in the exact way I say that, the word bitten off a little short, The complaint carried more in tone than in the word itself. Then it described the birches, the cluster of white-barked trees below the first switchback on the morning's climb, the angle of early light on their bark, the scar on one trunk in the rough shape of a door. I had not written any of that in my journal. I had not said it aloud. I had held it quietly inside my own mind like a small, kept thing. And now it was being recited back to me in my own voice by something sitting in the dark at the edge of a shelter on a mountain. It said it wanted me to unzip the bag. It said there was room. It said the cold was in the joints of its fingers, in that deep-seated way that cold settles into joints after a long day on the ridge. It said all of this with such exact fidelity to the patterns of my own speech that some wordless part of my brain kept trying to receive the sound as normal, kept trying to process it as my own thinking made accidentally audible. But I had not moved. My lips had not parted. The voice was coming from outside. I stayed absolutely still. Cinch cords tight at the hood, zipper at my chin, hands inside the bag, breathing as shallow and as silent as I could manage, which was not very silent, because fear has its own audible quality, a shallow and trembling quality, and I was afraid. It spoke again and again. The same memories, the same complaints, the same quiet begging. Let me in. It's cold. There's room. I'm so tired. Offered back to me in my own voice with the patience of something that has never needed to hurry. The hours passed with a slowness that had texture and weight. Time stretched until it lost its ordinary character and became something you moved through rather than something that moved past you. The rain did not relent. In the deep middle of the night it deepened further, and the tin roof grew so loud that the voice had to raise itself to be heard above it, and something about hearing my own voice raised, hearing my own cadences at the volume I associate with alarm, made everything considerably worse. Then, at some unmeasured hour, the figure turned its head. Not the way a person turns to look over a shoulder. No shift of torso, no roll of spine. The head simply rotated, slowly and smoothly, 180 degrees backward, the way a gear turns on an axle, until it faced directly into the dark interior of the shelter. The eyes were wide open, completely, perfectly unblinking. They caught the faint pulse of my headlamp's charging indicator, the small red LED that pulsed every few seconds when the lamp was off, and reflected it back as two identical pinprick points of light, floating motionless in the darkness, equidistant and patient, without expression of any kind. I held my breath. I held it until pressure built behind my eyes and my vision began to darken at the edges, until the sleeping bag became the whole of the world. Its warmth, the smell of old down and body heat, the absolute enclosure of it, and I held it still, because something in me understood, without evidence, without reason, that breath was the wrong thing to offer in that moment. The rain fell on the roof. The hollow breezed around me. The head rotated back, slowly, smoothly, facing the storm again. The two small points of reflected light vanished. The voice returned, lower now, quieter, almost gentle. It said it was tired. It said it had been walking for so very long, in the fog and in the dark, for longer than I could imagine. And it was cold, and it only wanted to rest. It only wanted to be let in. I did not answer. I lay in the warm dark of the bag and breathed as quietly as I could manage. And the rain measured out the hours on the tin roof in a continuous, enormous count, with no number and no end. Dawn does not arrive so much as it reasserts itself. Not a brightening, but a slow refusal of the dark to hold. The first thin, colorless light filtered through the fog and through the tarp and into the low interior of the shelter. Not warmth, not comfort, just light, the reluctant kind, a kind the mountain gives up only when it has no other choice. The figure at the platform edge was gone. I lay still for a long count of minutes, watching the empty space. The rain had softened to a slow drip from the overhang edge. The fog in the hollow was pulling back from the tree roots and the understory, like something retreating, though not, I noticed, to any true absence. At the edge of the platform, where the figure had been sitting, there was a pool of standing water. Not rain spatter, not roof runoff. A pool the shape and size of something that had sat in the rain for a very long time, and then simply ceased to be there. The boards around it were dry. I packed my gear in silence. I did not look back at the hollow as I climbed out of it and found the trail and walked north. And I walked until I reached a road crossing 6 miles on, and I did not stop again on the trail that season. But sometimes now, in the deep quiet of a still night when sleep is close, right there at that dissolving edge, I hear it rise up from somewhere below, the way certain things drift up from cold, dark water. my own voice, asking to come in, telling me it's cold, telling me there is room. The blazes moved. I swear to you, they moved. I stood in the dark and watched the paint gleam wet in the fog. And I knew before my legs even understood it, that something had stitched the trail shut behind me. There was something tall in the trees. Tall and quiet and patient, and it had a tin in its hand, and the sound it made when it moved. Now, I need you to settle in. Pull that blanket up a little higher. Let your breathing slow down. Because what I am about to tell you happened a long time ago, and I have carried it quiet for most of my life. Not because it frightens me anymore, though it did for years, it surely did, but because it is the kind of story that needs to be told in the dark, in a low voice, the way all true things eventually get told. This was in September, late September, when the leaves on the upper ridges had just started to turn, that first shy blush of orange and amber up at elevation, before the whole mountain catches fire with autumn. I was 41 days into a through hike of the Appalachian Trail, walking southbound, having started up in Maine at Katahdin, and working my way down through the long, hard bones of the Appalachian Range. 41 days of walking, 41 days of waking before the sun, lacing up boots still damp from the day before, filling a water bottle from a cold spring, and putting one foot in front of the other until the light failed, and sometimes a good while after. You get a certain kind of empty inside when you walk like that. A good empty, mostly. The noise of the regular world, the bills, the arguments, the appointments you keep missing, all of it falls away somewhere around the first 2 weeks. It does not leave loudly. It just thins out the way a radio signal fades when you drive into the mountains. And what is left when it is finally gone is just the weight of the pack on your shoulders, the slow burn in your legs, the smell of pine resin and cold stone, and your own honest sweat after a long climb. The trail becomes everything. Every white blaze painted on every tree becomes a small and steady promise. You are on the right path, it says. Keep going. Just keep going. I had been making good miles that day. Better than good, honestly. I had pushed through a long ridge walk in the morning, come down into a gap for water around midday, and climbed back up through a dense hemlock forest that afternoon. The kind of old forest so tight and quiet that the light inside it feels borrowed from another century. My knees were having their usual conversation with the descents by the time the sun started dropping behind the western ridges. That deep, grinding dialogue that worn-out joints conduct with gravity. Nothing I had not heard before. My plan had been a shelter. There was a 3-sided lean-to marked on my map approximately 9 miles from where I had stopped for lunch, up near a gap called Redthorn Gap, named for some old briar thicket that I suspect was long gone by the time I ever walked through there. I had been making good enough time that reaching it by dark felt reasonable. But the afternoon had softened on me the way afternoons do in the mountains, going gold and then going gray faster than you ever expect. And I found myself perhaps 2.5 miles short of the shelter when the light turned thin and the shadows started pooling deep between the trunks. I had a headlamp. I had done night hiking before, more times than I could count at that point. The decision to press on felt easy, uncomplicated, the way easy decisions always do in the moment before they become the decisions you spend the rest of your life turning over in your hands. I remember the exact moment the day finished. There is always an exact moment, though you rarely catch it as it happens. 1 minute the path is a dark ribbon threading through the dry leaf litter, visible in the fading ambient light. And the next minute it is just a suggestion, a theory of direction that you are following mostly on faith and memory. I switched on my headlamp and the world shrank to a cone of pale yellow light moving with me through the dark. The woods at night on the Appalachian Trail are not, in my experience, hostile. The sound you hear alongside the path, the crackle in the underbrush, the soft thud of something moving away through the leaves. Those are deer, mostly. Raccoons. The occasional porcupine rattling slowly through the dry ground cover like it has nowhere in particular to be. The woods are busy at night, but they are busy with a business that has nothing to do with you. Once you understand that, once you accept that you are just one more warm thing moving through a dark that existed long before you arrived and will continue long after you leave, the fear settles. It quiets down and sits in the corner and mostly leaves you alone. But that night, The woods were very quiet. I noticed it gradually, the way you notice a sound that has stopped. Not all at once, but slowly, like something being subtracted. The small night rustlings had gone still. The breeze that had been threading through the upper canopy had died down to nothing. The only sounds were my boots on the gravel and dry leaves, the slow, rhythmic pull of my own breathing, and the faint creak of my pack straps with each step. Nothing else. Not a single other living thing announcing itself in any direction. Then the fog came. Down in the hollows of the southern Appalachians, fog comes up from the ground in September like something breathing out. You walk through a gap and the air thickens suddenly, and your headlamp beam turns into a column of white that reflects back at you and makes it harder to see rather than easier. I had walked through fog on this trail before. I knew the cold feel of it on my face, that intimate wetness that settles on the skin. But this fog came in fast, and it came in dense. And within about 20 minutes of the dark settling completely, I could not see more than 15 feet in any direction. The trees beyond that boundary were just gray shapes, and then nothing. Just the fog, steady and total and very, very still. I slowed my pace. I kept my eyes moving from the ground immediately ahead of my boots to the trees on either side of the trail, watching for the white blazes. On a clear night, your headlamp picks them up easily. A flash of white paint on dark bark, 2 inches wide, 6 inches tall, placed at regular intervals so that in the dark you are never more than a few dozen yards from the next one. They are the whole system. The whole logic of the trail rests on those marks. You follow one, you find the next, and the mountain takes care of the rest. And here is where the first wrong thing happened. The blazes were wet. Not the way old paint gets wet in heavy mist, going dark and dull and faded. When fresh paint is wet, it has a different quality altogether. A thickness, a sheen, a slight raised edge in direct light that the old bleached blazes do not have. These blazes gleamed, every single one of them, bright and hard and glistening in my headlamp beam like they had been put on the bark within the last hour. I stopped at one and leaned close. The white was vivid. There was the faintest smell of latex beneath the cold pine smell of the air. I stood there for a moment in the fog and the quiet, and I thought about that. Trail maintainers do come out and refresh the blazes when they fade. It is not an unusual thing. They walk the trail in sections, touching up the marks, keeping the system whole. But they do not do it at night. Nobody paints trail blazes in the fog, in the dark, in the deep mountain hollow, 9 miles from the nearest road. I told myself the moisture was catching the light strangely. I told myself I was tired, which was true enough, that I could almost believe it was the whole explanation. 41 days of hard miles will do real things to your capacity for clean, rational thinking, especially past 10 o'clock at night, when your body has been politely requesting for several hours that you please just lie down and stop. So I kept walking. The trail began to descend. I registered this only as a vague unease at first, a feeling that the geography was not quite matching what I carried in my head from the morning's map study. Between where I had been and Red Thorn Gap, the trail ran along a moderate ridge with small elevation changes, some roll to it, some gentle pitch, but nothing dramatic. No significant drop, no bowl or hollow anywhere on the contour lines I had studied. But the trail under my boots was tilting downward now, more steeply with each quarter mile, pulling me into what felt like a deep depression in the land, a carved-out place between ridge shoulders that had no business being where I was. The fog thickened as I descended. The sound of my boots changed, went soft and muffled, the way sound changes when the air gets heavy. The trees closed in on either side until the path felt less like a trail and more like a narrow corridor between dark walls. Old growth, most of it. Trunks wide enough that 2 men could not put their arms around them. Root structures that humped out of the ground and crossed the trail like the backs of buried things. And then I saw the boulder, a large gray boulder sitting just off the left side of the trail, roughly the size and shape of an old cast-iron wood stove, with a clean diagonal crack running across its face from the upper left corner down to the lower right. I had seen that boulder before. I had touched that boulder, rested my right hand flat on the cold surface of it as I passed, the way hikers do with distinctive landmarks, acknowledging them. My hand remembered the texture of it, the cold of it. I stopped walking. I stood in the fog, and I looked at that boulder, and I made myself think very carefully and very slowly, the way you make yourself think when one part of your brain is beginning to shout and you need the quieter part to stay in charge a little longer. I'd passed this boulder going in one direction. I was now approaching it from the other side. I had not turned around. I had not doubled back, had not taken a side trail, had not sat down and rested and lost track of direction. I had walked in a single continuous forward direction, following the white blazes, one after another, for the better part of an hour. And the blazes had walked me in a circle. I I turned and looked back up the trail behind me, up into the wall of fog. The path was visible for perhaps 20 feet, and then it was gone, swallowed without ceremony. I turned back and looked ahead, and the trail curved gently to the right and disappeared into the same gray nothing. I was standing in the center of a closed loop, a geometric trap, drawn carefully in the dark of a mountain hollow that no map had ever recorded. I do not know how long I stood there, long enough for the cold to come through my jacket and settle into my shoulders, long enough for my headlamp to begin throwing the fog into shapes at the edge of its reach, the way tired eyes will try to make patterns from anything given long enough. And then one of those shapes did not dissolve when I blinked. It was standing at the very edge of my headlamp's reach, perhaps 30 feet up the trail from where I stood. Tall, considerably taller than any person I had ever seen, and thin in a way that my mind registered as wrong before I had words for it. Too long in the torso, the arms hanging at slightly wrong angles, the proportions of something assembled with care, but from different measurements than the ones the human body uses. It was completely still, the way certain animals go still when they cannot yet decide whether to hold or to run. In one hand, in what I understood to be the hand, something caught the pale outer edge of my headlamp beam. A tin, small and round, the kind a person might use to carry a quantity of thick paint, the kind a trail maintainer would carry, walking the blazes, keeping the marks fresh. It did not move toward me. It did not make a sound. It simply stood there in the fog, between me and the next blaze. And the next blaze was its blaze, laid down while I had been walking its loop, bright and wet and patient, pointing deeper into the dark and the hollow and the geometry it had built around me. I took one step backward, then another, and another, very slow, very quiet, keeping my headlamp on that shape for as long as I possibly could. My boots found the trail behind me without my eyes needing to look. Muscle memory carried me while my eyes stayed forward. The shape did not follow. It did not move at all. It waited, the way something waits when it is in no particular hurry, when it understands that the night is long and the hollow is patient and the blazes will be there in the morning, bright and wet and waiting on the bark. When the figure finally slipped out of the edge of my light, it did not disappear so much as it went back to being part of the fog, as though the fog was where it lived, what it was made of, when it was not busy with the paint tin and the long, dark work of the trail. I left the path. I walked on compass bearing, due east, counting my steps. I pushed through mountain laurel thickets that grabbed at my pack and my legs. I went over a low ridge in the dark, navigating by the feel of the slope and the needle in my compass, and nothing else. I came out eventually onto a gravel forest road. I heard it before I saw it, the way the sound of my steps changed from leaf litter to stone. I followed that road 3 miles in the quiet dark, just the sound of gravel and my own breathing, and the fog thinning slowly as I gained elevation. I came to a trailhead parking lot, and I sat on the hood of a stranger's truck, and I waited for the sky to go from black to gray to the pale, cold white of early morning. I never went back to that section of trail. I have studied the maps. The hollow I descended into that night, the bowl, the deep depression with its closed canopy and its old growth and its ground fog. It is not there. The topography on every printed map and every digital elevation model I have ever looked at shows a continuous ridge in that location, unbroken, exactly as I expected it to be when I planned my miles that morning. There is no hollow. There is no gap in the ridgeline that could hold that kind of geography. But I was there. I know the cold of that stone. My jacket still carried the smell of that fog when I got home. And somewhere in those mountains, in the quiet between the trees, in the hollows that do not appear on any map, something is still walking its slow and patient circuit in the dark, checking the blazes, keeping the paint fresh and bright, waiting for the next headlamp to come bobbing down a ridge in the late September night, tired and trusting, following the white marks the way we all do, the way we have to, out there where the path is the only thing standing between a person and the dark. So you just rest now. You are somewhere warm, somewhere safe, somewhere the fog cannot reach, and the trees are far away, and all the paths that lead to you tonight lead only inward, only downward, only into sleep. The blazes on the trees near you are just old paint, faded and dry and still. Nothing is walking the ridge tonight. Just rest now. Just rest. Okay. Okay, this is for whoever finds this. My name don't matter right now. What matters is the water. The water in the basin is running the wrong way. It's going up the pipe, not down. And I can hear it. I can hear it swallowing. And my reflection. It ain't blinking. I blinked. I blinked 3 times and it just kept looking at me. Like it's waiting for me to stop. Well now, set that dial down a notch, friend. Ain't no need to go rushing off into the dark just yet. Name's Silas Vance. Folks up around the Gap call me Abe on account of my granddaddy, and I never did correct 'em. I've lived on this ridge longer than most of the county's been drawing maps of it, and I've buried more good boots than I care to count. Not the men in 'em, mind you, just the boots. The men, well, the men don't always come back to leave their boots behind. You're safe where you're sitting. I want you to know that first, before anything else. Wherever you are, under your quilt, your truck idling in some gas station lot, your phone propped up against a water glass, you are safe. And I am only going to tell you a story. That's all this is. A story told slow, the way my daddy told 'em to me, the way his daddy told 'em to him, back when radio still hissed on Sunday nights, and nobody thought a thing of sitting in the dark listening to an old man talk about the woods. I've got a wood stove going low behind me tonight, just enough to keep the chill honest. And outside my window, the ridge is doing what it always does this time of year, going quiet, one creature at a time, till there's nothing left talking but the wind moving through bare branches. That's a good sound to fall asleep to. I want you holding on to that sound while I tell you this. But I want you to hear this one proper, because it's about a kind of thirst that has nothing to do with your throat. See, late October up on that high trail, the real high country, where the balls go gold and then gray and then bare, is a dry, dry time. The leaf fall soaks up whatever's left in the ground, and the seasonal springs, the little trickles that map apps and guidebooks swear are running year-round, they go quiet, bone dry, just a stain on the rock where water used to be. And a man walking 20-25 miles a day up there, breathing that thin, cold air, sweating under his pack even in the chill, that man's body starts lying to him before his mind ever catches up. Dehydration's a peculiar thief. It don't take your water first. It takes your judgment. Takes the sharp edges off your thinking, smooths them down round and easy, till a bad idea don't feel bad no more. it feels like relief. And relief on a dry ridge in the dark half of the year is the most dangerous feeling a body can have. My granddaddy used to say, the mountain don't hate you. That's important, and I want you to sit with it a moment. The mountain don't hate anybody. It's simply old and patient, and it has learned over a great long while that a tired man will do most of the deciding for it, if you only give him enough thirst, and enough fog, and enough time alone with his own tired thoughts. The mountain don't need to reach out and take a thing. It only needs to wait for a thing to wander close enough to fall. That's the part outsiders never understand about these hollows. They come up here thinking the danger's a bear or a drop-off or bad weather rolling in fast. And sure, those'll kill a careless man, same as anywhere. But the oldest danger up on this ridge has always been quieter than that. Softer. It sounds like relief, and it looks like a hand-lettered sign, and it waits for you to be thirsty enough to stop asking questions. There was a hiker come through here 2 Octobers back. Experienced fella, I want you to understand that, because I don't want you thinking this only happens to the foolish. This one had the miles in him, had the gear, had the maps loaded up proper, had done the whole trail twice before, north to south, south to north, knew how to read a ridge line, knew how to read weather coming in off a gap. What he didn't know how to read was the fog that rolled in on him that afternoon. It come up milk-white and total, the way it does sometimes on those high balls, swallowing the trail 30 feet ahead and 30 feet behind. So a man walks in a little moving room made of nothing but gray. No birds in a fog like that. No wind you can feel, only wind you can hear, moving through trees you can't see the shape of. Just his own boots on the rock, and his own breath getting drier and drier in his chest. He'd gone 12 miles past his last known water. Every seasonal spring on his map, dry. Every little side trail he tried, dry. His bottles were down to that last warm inch you save for emergencies. And a man gets real careful with an inch of water, real reverent about it. He was doing the math in his head the way thirsty men do. How many hours to the next shelter? How many hours of light left? How much of that inch he could allow himself before his throat closed up on him for good. And that's when he saw the sign. Wasn't on any map. Wasn't official Forest Service lettering either. Just a hand-carved plank, gray with age, nailed low to a black birch at the edge of the trail, pointing down into a thicket of laurel so dense and old it had grown into itself. A tunnel of dark green going down and down into a hollow the fog hadn't even bothered to fill. on account of the sun never reached down in there to make the kind of warmth that fog needs to breathe. He stood there a long moment, he told me. Long enough for his own breathing to slow down and get loud in his ears. Long enough to notice how the moss on that plank grew thick and soft, the way moss only grows where it's left alone a good long while. Something in him, some small, quiet voice underneath all that thirst, told him to keep walking the marked trail, to trust his map over some old carved word nailed to a tree that had no business being there at all. But thirst has a voice louder than caution, friend, and his throat had gone past dry into something closer to raw. One word cut deep into that plank. Spring. Now you and I, sitting comfortable, we might ask why a smart man follows a hand-carved sign into a hole in the earth that ain't on any map. But you haven't felt what a truly dry mouth does to a man's better sense. Relief was calling to him from down in that laurel. And relief don't wait for a man to ask sensible questions. He stepped off the marked trail. That was the mistake, the whole and entire mistake right there. One boot leaving the packed dirt of the known path and finding the soft, dead leaf hush of the unknown. Everything after was just the shape that mistake took. Down he went, into a gap so tight and dim it swallowed the last gray daylight whole. Down where the air went instantly colder, thick with the smell of wet oak leaves gone black and soft with rot. And under that, something colder still, a mineral smell, like a well nobody had drawn from in 100 years. And there, at the bottom, no bigger than a bathtub, sat a still black pool, glassy and perfect, fed by a rusted iron pipe somebody long dead had driven straight down into the mountain's own throat. He was so thirsty. That's the thing I need you to understand and hold on to and not let go of, because it's the truest part of this whole story. He was so thirsty that he did not stop to wonder who drove that pipe, or when, or why a spring this deep in a hollow this dark would ever need a marker at all, out here where no map maker had ever thought to walk. He shrugged off his pack, let it fall heavy into the wet leaves behind him, got down on both knees at the edge of that black little pool, the way a man kneels at an altar, and every ounce of his attention, every last scrap of the awareness that had kept him alive through 20 years of wild country, he poured down into that 6 inches of water in front of his face. Now understand something about hollows like that one. The laurel don't just block the light. It swallows sound, too, wraps it up close and small, so a man kneeling at the bottom of one can't hardly hear past his own hands and his own breath. No bird call reaching down that far. No far-off truck engine on some logging road to remind him the ordinary world was still turning up above. Just him and the pool and the cold coming up off the black water like a held breath waiting to be let out, which left his whole broad back turned, open and unwatching, to the absolute dark of the laurel tunnel behind him. He hooked his gravity filter to that iron pipe with cold, clumsy fingers. You know the sound if you've ever done it yourself. That soft rubber seat pressing snug, then the slow metallic tick, tick, tick as the bladder starts to fill, patient as a clock in an empty house. At first it filled the way it should, tick, 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 and the weight of clean water swelling the bag in his hands, and something in his chest finally easing. The promise of relief so close now he could almost feel it wet on his tongue. Then the ticking changed. It slowed. Then it stuttered. Then, and he told me this himself, told it to me plain and sober, not a man given to fancy. Then it went backward. The water in the clear tubing began to move the wrong direction, not dripping down into his bag no more, but drawing up, out of it, back through the filter, back into that iron pipe, with a low, wet hiss like a held breath finally let go. He watched 3 days' worth of hard-won water get pulled right back out of his own gear, back down into the black little pool, and the pool did not rise one bit to receive it. It just kept it, the way dry ground keeps rain. And that hissing, soft and even and patient, was the only sound in that whole hollow. No birds, no wind reaching down that deep, just the hiss and his own heartbeat, which he said felt slower than it ought to. He leaned in close, confused now beneath the thirst, and switched on his headlamp to see better into that black water. And he saw himself looking back up at him. That's not so strange, you might think. Still water throws a reflection. Every man's seen his own face in a puddle. But this reflection did not move the way reflections are meant to move. He tilted his head to the left. The face in the water stayed dead center, eyes fixed straight up at him. He raised his hand slow, up toward his own jaw, the way a man does without thinking, checking himself. The reflection's hand did not rise to meet it. It stayed exactly as it was, wide-eyed, unblinking, mouth very slightly open, like a man caught mid-word and frozen there, patient as that hollow itself, patient as a thing that has learned it does not need to hurry. He said the worst part wasn't the wrongness of it. The worst part was how familiar it felt, like he'd been looking at that same still, waiting face his whole life, and just never noticed till that hiss started drawing him out through the water, drop by drop, same as his gear. He told me he sat back on his heels a long while, just looking, the way a man will look at a thing his mind refuses to finish understanding all at once. The cold had gone from his knees up into his hips by then, and the hissing from the pipe kept its same slow, patient rhythm. Tick and hiss, tick and hiss. And somewhere in that rhythm he lost count of how long he'd been kneeling there. Minutes, maybe longer. Time gets thin at the bottom of a hollow like that, thin as the last inch of water in a bottle. And through it all, that reflection never once looked away from him. Now I'll tell you what he told me, and what the old families up on this ridge have always half known and never much cared to say aloud. They call it the spring kneeler, not because it drowns you. It's got no interest in that. No interest in your body at all, truth told. It wants what a drowning never takes. It wants the you of you, your face, your memory, the particular way you hold your own name in your mind. It hollows a man out slow and gentle, the same slow and gentle way that filter draws water backward through the tube, siphoning a little more of him with every hissing breath the pipe takes, until there's nothing behind his eyes but a still surface with nobody home to trouble it. And when it's had its fill, when the last of him is drawn back down into that mineral dark, it rises up out of the pool wearing his shape and his clothes and his boots, and walks back up out of the laurels same as any tired hiker heading for the next shelter. Kind smile, right words. Nobody along that trail the wiser, because it's learned to wear a person the way a hand learns a glove. That's why you never find the bodies up on that ridge, friend. There ain't a body to find. Just a pack, left sittin' in wet leaves at the edge of a black little pool, and a plank of old gray wood, one word carved deep, waitin' on the next dry throat to come stumblin' by. Some of the old families say the sign's been there longer than any of the maps, longer than the trail itself, cut by hands nobody remembers, and nailed to a birch that keeps on livin' long after every other tree around it dies back. Some say it moves a little from season to season, always finding some new stretch of dry ridge to wait along. I don't know if that part's true. I only know I've seen that same carved word twice in my own long life, in two different hollows a good 10 miles apart, and both times I was thirsty enough to read it twice before I made myself turn around. That's the only reason I'm here talking to you tonight, instead of down in some laurel thicket myself, wearing somebody else's boots. So you rest easy now, wherever you are. You're not on any high, dry ridge tonight. You're not 12 miles past your last known water, and there's no fog pressing in close around you, and no hand-carved sign pointing you down into the dark. But should you ever find yourself up there, should the fog come in milk-white and total, and your bottles run down to that last warm inch, and you see a plank of old wood pointing off the marked trail into the laurel, promising you relief, you remember old Abe, and you remember what waits patient at the bottom of that hollow, ticking soft as a clock, hissing soft as a held breath, and you stay on the path. Good night now. Sleep easy.